Good evening. Settle into a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries with me tonight. We're going to spend the next few hours in the company of a Roman centurion, not the heroic figure of film and legend, charging gloriously into battle, with sword raised high, but the real centurion, the one who spent most of his days inspecting sandal straps, mediating petty disputes between irritable soldiers, and checking supply inventories in the dim light of oil lamps. Tonight's journey takes us to the edges of the Roman Empire, to the frontier forts along the Germanic lines, where the rhythm of military life beat with a steady, unremarkable pulse. Here, in these distant garrisons, centurions enforced the discipline that held Rome together, one tedious day at a time. The work was rarely glorious. It was repetitive, administrative, physically exhausting, and often profoundly monotonous. As you listen, let the details wash over you. There's no need to remember every fact or follow every thread. Simply allow yourself to be present in these ancient routines, in the smell of leather and lamp oil, in the endless cycles of inspection and drill. The past we're visiting tonight is not one of excitement or drama, but of duty performed day after day, season after season, year after year. Let us begin. Imagine yourself waking in the half-light before dawn, in a small stone chamber within a frontier fort somewhere along the Rhine. The air is cool and damp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from banked fires and the earthy smell of the surrounding forests. You are a centurion of the legions, responsible for approximately 80 men your century, and this morning will unfold much like every other morning has for the past 3 years. The routine begins at the 5th hour, around 5 in the morning by our reckoning. There is no luxurious awakening, no gradual transition from sleep to consciousness. A centurion rises when duty demands it, and duty demands it every day. You pull on your tunic, already knowing its rough wool texture against your skin, already anticipating the weight of your armor that will soon follow. The day's tasks crowd your mind before you've even left your quarters. The morning inspection, the equipment checks, the training drills, the paperwork, always the paperwork. You step out into the fort's Principia, the central area, where the morning air bites at exposed skin. Other soldiers are already moving about their duties, their breath visible in the cold. The fort itself is a study in Roman organization, rectangular, methodical, with streets laid out in perfect grid patterns. Everything has its place. Everyone has their role. And you, as centurion, must ensure that both remain exactly where they should be. Your first responsibility is the morning roll call. The soldiers of your century assemble in their contubernium groups, the 8-man units that share tents on campaign and barracks in permanent forts. You move among them, noting who is present, who appears unwell, who has the telltale signs of having spent the previous evening drinking too much of the sour wine that passes for refreshment in this remote posting. Your eyes scan their faces, their posture, their equipment. This is not a cursory glance. This is the practiced assessment of a man whose survival, and the survival of his men, depends on maintaining standards. The inspection that follows roll call is exhaustive and unforgiving. You examine each soldier's helmet. Is it polished? Is it free of dents that might compromise its protective capacity? The larica segmentata, the segmented armor that has become the signature protection of the legionary, must be checked for rust, for loose fastenings, for any sign of neglect. Shields must be sturdy, their leather coverings intact, their metal bosses secure. Javelins must have straight shafts and sharp points. Even the mundane tools, the delabra for digging, the sickle for cutting, must be accounted for and in good repair. This inspection takes well over an hour. It is repetitive work. Most days, you find little wrong. A bit of rust here, a loose strap there. But the inspection must happen regardless, because discipline erodes not in dramatic collapses, but in tiny increments of carelessness. You have performed this same inspection hundreds of times. You will perform it hundreds more. Once the morning inspection concludes, the administrative duties begin. This is the aspect of a centurion's life that no epic poem celebrates, no historian dwells upon, yet it consumes hours of every day. You must maintain records. Who is present? Who is on leave? Who is assigned to which duty? Who has been disciplined, and for what infraction? These records are not optional niceties. They are the lifeblood of Roman military administration, the means by which the legion functions as a coordinated whole, rather than as 80 individual soldiers making independent decisions. You record sick calls, noting who claims illness and whether you believe them. You record equipment issues, tracking which items need replacement or repair. You record punishments meted out for infractions. The soldier who fell asleep on watch, the one who spoke disrespectfully to a superior, the one who returned late from leave in the nearby vicus, the civilian settlement that clusters around the fort seeking Roman coin. The paperwork is written on wooden tablets coated with wax, your stylus scratching out neat letters in abbreviated military Latin. Your hand cramps. The light from the oil lamp flickers and strains your eyes. Outside, you can hear the sounds of the fort soldiers calling to one another, the rhythmic thud of construction work, the distant lowing of cattle kept for meat and leather. But here, in this small room, you write, you record. You document the mundane machinery of empire. Sometimes there are reports to compose for the tribune or the legate commanding the legion. These must be concise yet thorough in accounting of your century's readiness, any significant incidents, supply needs, observations from recent patrols. The language must be precise. The facts must be accurate. Roman military hierarchy values clear communication and punishes ambiguity. By mid-morning, it is time for training. The soldiers have finished their meager breakfast of bread, perhaps some cheese, possibly some olives if supplies have been good. They assemble in the training ground, and you lead them through drills they have performed so many times that their bodies move through the motions almost without conscious thought. Weapons training begins with the wooden practice swords and shields heavier than their real counterparts, designed to build strength and endurance. The soldiers strike at wooden posts, following the patterns of thrust and parry that have been drilled into them since their earliest days in the legion. You watch, correcting stances, adjusting grips, calling out when someone's footwork becomes sloppy. The clack of wooden swords against wooden posts becomes a rhythm repetitive and almost meditative. Formation drills follow. The sentry must be able to move as one, to form defensive squares, to execute flanking maneuvers, to respond instantly to commands. You shout orders advance, halt, turn, form testudo with shields locked overhead and in front. The soldiers comply, their movements synchronized through endless repetition. On a real battlefield, this training saves lives. Here, in the daily routine of a frontier fort, it is simply another task to complete, another hour to fill with the maintenance of readiness. There are marching drills as well. A Roman soldier must be able to march 20 miles in a day, wearing full equipment. The route takes your century out beyond the fort's walls, along the roads that Rome has built to connect its far-flung territories. The soldiers march in step, carrying packs that contain their gear, their rations, the tools they would need to construct a marching camp if this were a genuine campaign rather than a training exercise. You walk alongside them, noting who struggles, who maintains pace effortlessly, who might need additional attention, or perhaps a lighter load due to an injury not quite healed. The monotony of these drills is intentional. Battle is chaotic and terrifying, but Roman military doctrine holds that soldiers who have performed actions 1,000 times in practice will perform them even when exhausted, even when afraid, even when the world has collapsed into screaming confusion. So you drill them, again and again, day after day. The afternoon brings rotation of guard duties. The fort must be manned at all times, towers along the walls, gates that control access, critical supply points where food and weapons are stored. As Centurion, you are responsible for ensuring that the guard rotation functions smoothly, that each soldier knows his post and his responsibilities, that the passwords are distributed and understood. Guard duty is tedious work. A soldier stands at his post for hours, watching the forest beyond the walls, the road that leads away toward civilization, the river that marks the boundary between Roman territory and the lands of the Germanic tribes. Most days, nothing happens. The hours pass slowly. Boredom is the enemy as much as any external threat, because boredom leads to inattention, and inattention can be fatal. You make rounds throughout the day, checking on your guards. You appear at irregular intervals, never predictable, always a possibility. This keeps the men alert. You exchange a few words, ask if they've seen anything unusual, remind them of their responsibilities. Mostly, they haven't seen anything. The frontier is often quiet, days blending into one another with little to distinguish them. Patrols venture out beyond the fort's walls, following routes that have been established through years of occupation. These patrols have multiple purposes. They watch for enemy scouts or troop movements. They intercept potential deserters or smugglers. They assert Roman presence in the surrounding territory, and they gather intelligence about the local tribes. You sometimes lead these patrols yourself, but more often you send a trusted optio or tesserarius, your subordinate officers, while you remain at the fort, managing its daily operations. The patrols are maintained day and night, their frequency increased in times of heightened tension. During peaceful periods, they become routine a march through familiar territory, a check of known landmarks, perhaps a brief conversation with locals who have accepted Roman authority, then a return to the fort with little to report. It is necessary work, but rarely interesting work. A significant portion of a centurion's duties involves overseeing construction and maintenance work. Roman forts and roads do not maintain themselves. The wooden palisades must be repaired when they rot or are damaged by weather. Ditches must be cleared of debris. Roads must be kept passable, their surfaces repaired when they develop ruts or washouts. Drainage systems must be maintained to prevent the fort from becoming a muddy morass during rainy seasons. You assign work details, allocating soldiers to specific tasks. Some will cut wood from the nearby forests, processing it into the timbers and planks needed for repairs. Others will quarry stone if there are nearby deposits suitable for construction. Still others will carry out the actual repair, work digging, hauling, fitting, constructing. This labor is physically demanding. A Roman soldier in a frontier fort might work 12 to 18 hours on particularly busy days. The work is often unglamorous, digging latrines, hauling supplies, repairing barrack roofs, yet it is essential. The infrastructure of empire requires constant attention, and soldiers provide much of the labor. As Centurion, you supervise rather than participate in the heaviest labor, but you are expected to be present to ensure the work is done properly and efficiently. You inspect the quality of construction, making certain that corners are not cut, that materials are not wasted, that the final product meets Roman standards. Your men may grumble at the work. It is their right as soldiers to complain, so long as they continue to obey, but the work continues regardless. As the day wanes toward evening, the fort's routine shifts but does not cease. There is an evening meal, more substantial than breakfast, but still simple, perhaps a poles, a porridge of grain, or bread with cheese, olives, and diluted wine. The soldiers eat in their contubernium groups, the conversation ranging over the day's events, complaints about officers, hopefully not about you, though you are realistic about soldiers' need to vent frustrations, plans for their next leave, letters from home, if any have arrived with recent supply wagons. You take your own meal separately, in the quarters designated for officers. The food may be slightly better, and officers' pay allows for a few luxuries, but not dramatically so. Frontier forts are not places of abundance. The evening requires another round of inspections. You check that the guard posts are properly manned for the night watch. You ensure that fires are banked safely, that equipment is secured, that the fort is prepared for whatever the night might bring. Night brings particular vulnerabilities. Darkness favors attackers. Sentries must be especially vigilant, and you must be especially attentive to ensuring their vigilance. There may be disciplinary matters to address. A soldier who violated camp regulations, who returned drunk from the Vicus, who quarreled with a comrade. As Centurion, you are not merely a military leader, but also a judge and enforcer of order. Minor infractions you can handle yourself, meting out punishments such as extra guard duty, reduced rations, or physical punishment. The Centurion's vine staff is not merely a symbol of rank, but also an instrument of discipline. More serious matters must be referred up the chain of command, but you are expected to maintain order within your century, without constantly appealing to higher authority. Finally, as the night deepens, you return to your own quarters. There may be correspondence to write letters to family, if you have them, and if you maintain those connections despite the distances and difficulties of military life. There may be personal equipment to maintain, though as an officer, your kit is likely in better condition than that of the common soldiers. Mostly, though, there is fatigue, the deep weariness that comes from a day filled with supervision, inspection, decision-making, and the constant low-level stress of responsibility. You lie down in the darkness, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same routine: the morning inspection, the administrative work, the training drills, the supervision of construction projects, the checks on guard posts, the endless cycle of maintaining discipline, maintaining readiness, maintaining the standards that Rome demands of its military. This routine continues not just day after day, but season after season. Winter brings particular hardships to a frontier fort. The cold is penetrating, the days short, the nights long. Supply wagons may be delayed by snow or impassable roads. The soldiers huddle around fires, their breath visible in the frigid air of the barracks. Training continues. Rome does not grant its soldiers the luxury of a winter respite, but it becomes harder, more miserable. You enforce the routine because the routine is what prevents deterioration, what keeps your century ready for action, even when action seems unlikely during the frozen months. Spring brings relief from the cold, but also increased activity. Roads become passable again. Trade resumes. There may be new arrivals at the fort, reinforcements, replacements for men who have completed their service or who have died from disease or accident. There may be diplomatic missions to local tribes, with you and your century providing security. The patrol schedule intensifies as the campaigning season approaches, though whether any actual campaign will materialize is a decision made far above your rank. Summer is the season of potential warfare, though even in summer, actual combat may be rare. Most of your time is still consumed by the mundane necessities of military life. But the possibility of action adds attention to the routine, a heightened alertness. Scouts range farther. Patrols are larger and more frequent. Your inspections become even more thorough, because you cannot predict when training might suddenly become reality. Autumn brings the harvest, not your concern directly, but it affects the fort because local food production determines how easily the garrison can be supplied during the coming winter. It is also a time of assessment, of accounting. Have there been losses that need to be replaced? Is equipment in good enough condition to last through another year? Or must requests be sent for replacements? Your administrative duties increase as you compile reports, make inventories, plan for the year ahead. And then winter returns, and the cycle continues. As a centurion, you occupy an unusual position in the Roman military hierarchy. You are not of the senatorial or equestrian class. Those positions are reserved for the tribunes and the legate who command the legion. You are a career soldier, promoted from the ranks through a combination of merit, connections, and longevity. The soldiers under your command were once your peers. Now they must obey you without question, and you must enforce that obedience. This creates a particular psychological burden. You must maintain distance from the men you command, because familiarity erodes authority. Yet you must also understand them, know their strengths and weaknesses. Recognize when someone is genuinely ill versus when someone is malingering. You must be fair. Arbitrary cruelty breeds resentment and undermines cohesion, but you must also be firm. Discipline cannot be negotiable. The vine staff you carry is the symbol of your authority. It is also, quite literally, the tool by which you enforce that authority. You have used it to strike soldiers who failed to meet standards, who disobeyed orders, who endangered their comrades through carelessness or inattention. This is not cruelty for its own sake. The Roman military has no patience for officers who abuse their position, but it is a harsh reality of maintaining the discipline that keeps 80 men functioning as a coordinated unit, rather than as individuals pursuing their own interests. You also bear responsibility for the welfare of your century. When supplies are short, you must ensure fair distribution. When illness strikes, you must decide who is genuinely sick and who is attempting to avoid duty. When disputes arise between soldiers, you must mediate and render judgment. You are father figure, judge, taskmaster, and protector all at once, a complex role that requires constant balancing of competing demands. The loneliness of this position is rarely acknowledged, but always present. You cannot confide in your subordinates. That would undermine your authority. You have peers among the other centurions of the cohort and legion, and with them, you can share some of the burdens of command. But even these relationships are shaped by competition, by the knowledge that promotions are limited, and that your success may come at another's expense. Trust is a scarce commodity in the Roman military, as scarce as glory in the daily routine of a frontier fort. The centurion of popular imagination is a figure of heroic action leading charges, inspiring men through personal courage, winning victories through tactical brilliance. And yes, those moments exist. In 25 years of service, you may participate in several campaigns, perhaps witness a few genuine battles. Those experiences are intense, terrifying, and transformative. They are also relatively rare. The vast majority of your time as centurion is consumed by what we have described tonight: the inspections, the drills, the administrative work, the supervision of construction projects, the maintenance of discipline, the enforcement of standards. This is not the material of epic poetry. It is repetitive, often tedious, physically tiring, and mentally draining work. It is also absolutely essential. Rome's military dominance rests not primarily on individual heroism, but on systematic organization, on the ability to maintain professional armies at distant frontiers year after year, on the grinding persistence of soldiers who follow orders and maintain standards even when those orders are boring and those standards seem unnecessarily stringent. Your daily routine: inspection, drill, supervision, punishment, inspection again, is the foundation upon which empire rests. As you lie in your quarters on another night, much like every other night, you might reflect on this reality. The glory belongs to the generals whose names will be remembered, whose triumphs will be celebrated in Rome. The daily burden belongs to centurions like yourself, maintaining discipline and readiness in obscure forts along distant frontiers, performing the unglamorous work that allows those generals to achieve their celebrated victories. Tomorrow, you'll wake again at the 5th hour. There will be another roll call, another inspection, another day of drills and supervision and administrative work. The routine will continue, as it always does, as it must if Rome is to remain Rome. This is the reality of being a centurion, not dramatic, not exciting, but essential. The steady, boring, unglamorous maintenance of military professionalism, day after day, year after year, until your service finally ends, and another centurion takes your place to continue the same routine. The rhythm of military life continues, unchanging and unceasing, the heartbeat of empire measured in inspections and drills rather than in glory and conquest. Imagine the young Maximus arriving at a legionary fortress, perhaps in Germania, or along the Danube frontier. He was 18 or 19 years old, committing himself to 25 years of service, the standard term that would define the next quarter century of his life. The choice was not reversible. Once he took the sacramentum, the military oath, he belonged to the Legion. Desertion was punishable by death. There would be no changing his mind, no deciding after a few months that military life did not suit him. The commitment was absolute. The first years would have been the hardest. As a new recruit, Maximus occupied the lowest tier of military hierarchy. He learned to march in formation, to maintain equipment, to obey orders without question or hesitation. He slept in barracks with 7 other men, his contubernium brothers, sharing cramped quarters where privacy was unknown and personal space, a luxury no one possessed. He ate simple food, performed exhausting labor, and grew accustomed to the constant surveillance of centurions who examined every aspect of his performance. But Maximus possessed qualities that distinguished him from many of his fellow soldiers. He was literate, capable not merely of scratching out his name, but of reading complex texts and writing clearly. He was numerate able to perform the calculations necessary for military administration. These skills, unremarkable in the civilian world of commerce and governance, were valuable assets in the military context, where many soldiers came from rural backgrounds and possessed limited formal education. Within a few years, Maximus's abilities earned him his first promotion beyond the ranks of ordinary legionaries. He became a signifer, a standard-bearer responsible not only for carrying one of the century's standards, but also for managing the soldiers' savings. This was not a ceremonial role. Roman soldiers received regular pay, and a portion of that pay was held in a collective fund managed by the signifer. The position required trustworthiness, mathematical ability, and meticulous record-keeping. Maximus would have maintained accounts, tracked deposits and withdrawals, and ensured that the century's funds were properly secured and administered. The work was largely clerical. While his former comrades continued with the physical labor of construction projects and the routine of weapons training, Maximus spent increasing amounts of time with wax tablets and papyrus, recording transactions, calculating balances, preparing reports. It was indoor work, relatively speaking conducted in administrative spaces rather than on parade grounds. The physical demands were less intense. The mental demands, however, increased. Mistakes in financial record-keeping could have serious consequences, both for the soldiers whose savings were at stake and for Maximus himself, whose trustworthiness was constantly being evaluated. After several years as signifer, Maximus advanced to the position of cornicularius, senior clerk to the legion's administrative staff. This promotion moved him further from the daily routines of ordinary soldiers and deeper into the bureaucratic machinery that sustained the legion's operations. As cornicularius, he worked closely with senior officers, preparing correspondence, maintaining personnel records, tracking supply inventories, and managing the endless documentation that Roman military administration demanded. The legion was not merely a fighting force, but also a complex administrative organization responsible for logistics, engineering projects, financial management, and coordination with civilian authorities. The cornicularius stood at the center of this administrative web. The work was detailed and consuming. Hours passed in stuffy offices, copying reports, preparing documents for couriers who would carry them to other legion posts or to provincial governors. There were rosters to maintain: who was present, who was on detached duty, who had been promoted or demoted, who had died or been invalided out of service. There were supply records, quantities of grain, oil, wine, tools, weapons, armor components, leather for repairs, metal for fabrication. Every item needed to be accounted for. Discrepancies needed to be investigated and explained. Roman military administration tolerated neither sloppiness nor dishonesty. Next came perhaps the most important posting of Maximus's pre-Centurion career. He was appointed optio et spem ordinis. This Latin phrase translates roughly as assistant centurion with hope of promotion, a position that guaranteed eventual advancement to centurion rank as soon as a vacancy became available. Maximus had reached the threshold of commissioned authority. He served now as deputy to a centurion, learning the practical realities of command, participating in disciplinary decisions, leading troops when the centurion was absent or occupied with other duties. But there was a challenge. Vacancies did not appear on demand. A centurion's position became available only when someone retired, died, was promoted to a higher centurion grade, or was dismissed for incompetence. In a legion with approximately 60 centurions, such openings were relatively rare, and Maximus was not the only optio ad spem ordinis waiting for advancement. Competition was subtle but ever-present. Multiple ambitious men watched for the same limited opportunities. Years passed. Maximus continued his duties as optio, performing competently, maintaining the standards expected of someone destined for centurion rank. But the promotion did not come. Other men he had served alongside had long since completed their 25 years and received their honorable discharge, returning to civilian life with their savings and their military land grants. Maximus remained in service, waiting for the promotion that had been promised but not yet delivered. This waiting period, which would eventually stretch to approximately 20 years, required a particular kind of endurance. It was not the physical endurance demanded by forced march or the courage required in battle. It was the psychological endurance of sustained patience, of continuing to perform duties competently while advancement remained perpetually on the horizon, but never quite within reach. Lesser men might have grown bitter, their performance declining as hope eroded. Maximus maintained his standards. Perhaps he had internalized the military virtue of duty for its own sake. Perhaps he simply lacked alternatives. Regardless, he persisted. Finally, during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, somewhere around the year 118 CE, after Maximus had already served approximately 20 years, the promotion came. A centurion position opened, and Maximus, with his guaranteed advancement and his proven record of administrative competence, was elevated to the rank he had been pursuing for 2 decades. He was no longer an assistant, but a commander, no longer waiting for authority, but wielding it, no longer serving under others, but responsible for the 80 men of his century. One might imagine this as a moment of triumph, of vindication after years of patient waiting. But the reality was likely more measured. Maximus was now in his late 30s or early 40s, older than many centurions, who often achieved the rank earlier in their careers. He had spent most of his adult life in military service, much of it in administrative roles, rather than in the more traditional path of distinguished combat service. His soldiers, many of them younger, might view him with some skepticism. Was he truly tested? Did his administrative background prepare him adequately for the practical demands of command? Maximus would need to prove himself. The vine staff he now carried, the symbol of centurion authority, was both a badge of achievement and a burden of expectation. He needed to demonstrate that his years of patient service had prepared him for this role, that his administrative expertise translated into effective leadership, that his relatively advanced age brought wisdom rather than simply weariness. Over the remaining years of his career, Maximus served in 5 different legions. Each transfer meant uprooting from established routines, traveling to new frontier postings, learning the specific practices and expectations of a new legion, earning the respect of new soldiers who had no history with him and no reason to trust him beyond his rank. Some transfers took him to legions in Germania, others perhaps to Britannia, or along the Danube, or in the eastern provinces. Each location brought different challenges, different enemies, different climates, different supply situations, different relationships with local civilian populations. The transfers also meant that Maximus never developed deep roots in any single location. While ordinary soldiers might serve their entire careers in one legion, gradually accumulating connections and relationships, centurions like Maximus moved through a series of temporary assignments. Home was wherever the legion happened to be stationed. Friendships were provisional, subject to the next transfer order. The military became not just a career, but a total way of life, encompassing everything, leaving little space for anything outside the legionary structure. At some point during these later years of service, possibly during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, 132 to 136 CE, Maximus earned a corona muralis, a mural crown, awarded for being first over the wall during the siege of an enemy fortification. This was a significant military decoration, recognition of conspicuous courage in one of the most dangerous actions a soldier could undertake. Scaling enemy walls under a hail of projectiles, fighting hand-to-hand on narrow ramparts where a single misstep meant a fatal fall, required exceptional bravery and physical capability. For Maximus, now in his 50s, this achievement carried particular significance. He had spent most of his career in administrative roles, had waited 20 years for his Centurion promotion, might have been viewed by some as more clerk than warrior. The mural crown proved otherwise. Whatever his age, whatever his background, he had demonstrated courage in the crucible of combat. The decoration was not merely a personal honor, but a vindication of his entire career path, proof that administrative competence and military valor were not mutually exclusive. The Bar Kokhba revolt itself was a brutal conflict, marked by fierce resistance and savage reprisals. Roman forces faced an organized rebellion in difficult terrain, fighting against determined enemies who employed guerrilla tactics and fortified positions. The siege warfare that characterized much of the campaign was grinding and dangerous, lacking the dramatic appeal of set-piece battles, but every bit as deadly. Maximus's mural crown was earned in this context, not in the romanticized warfare of legend, but in the difficult, unglamorous reality of suppressing a revolt through systematic reduction of fortified positions. Maximus died after 40 years of total military service. Whether he died in battle, from disease, or from the accumulated toll of decades of military life, we do not know. His tombstone, erected by family or comrades, recorded the basic facts of his career: the long wait for promotion, the service in multiple legions, the mural crown that marked his courage. These inscriptions were not elaborate narratives, but compressed summaries, highlighting the key points by which Roman military culture measured a career's worth. 40 years. Consider what that span of time represents. Maximus had entered the legions as a young man during Trajan's reign, when the empire was at its greatest territorial extent. He lived through Hadrian's consolidation of frontiers, the construction of walls and fortifications meant to hold rather than expand. He witnessed policy shifts, changes in military tactics and organization, the slow evolution of Roman military practice across decades. Nearly his entire adult life, from youth through middle age into the elderly years by Roman standards, had been consumed by military service. What did Maximus think about during those long years? Did he maintain enthusiasm for the work, or did it become simply what he did, the defining structure of his existence? Did the mural crown, earned so late in his career, bring satisfaction, or did it seem a small recognition for decades of anonymous service? Did he ever regret the civilian life he might have led, the family he might have raised, the business he might have built if he had not committed himself to 25 years, and then 40 in the legions? Maximus's career exemplifies certain patterns that recurred throughout Roman military history. First, the importance of literacy and administrative competence in creating pathways to promotion. The Roman military required not only fighting ability, but also bureaucratic skill. Men like Maximus, capable with accounts and correspondence, found opportunities that purely martial soldiers might not access. Second, the extraordinary patience required to advance through the system. 20 years from optio et spem ordinis, the actual Centurion ranked 2 decades of waiting, while others completed entire careers and moved on to civilian life. Roman military advancement operated on timescales that demanded sustained commitment and deferred gratification. Men needed to maintain performance and dedication, not for months or even years, but for decades, with no guarantee that the expected reward would ever materialize. Third, the peripatetic nature of Centurion service. 5 different legions over the course of a career meant constant adaptation, perpetual status as the newcomer despite decades of experience, relationships that were always temporary because the next transfer order might arrive at any time. This mobility served Roman military interests by distributing experienced officers throughout the empire, but it came at significant personal cost to the centurions themselves. Fourth, the extension of service beyond the standard 25-year term. While ordinary legionaries could look forward to honorable discharge after a quarter century, centurions often continued serving for much longer periods. Some served 30, 40, even 50 years. The reasons varied: financial incentives, lack of civilian alternatives, genuine commitment to military life, or simply momentum, the difficulty of imagining a different existence after so many decades in uniform. Maximus's 40 years places him within this pattern of extended service that consumed not just a portion of life, but essentially the entirety of adult existence. Marcus Sabatius Maximus was not famous in his own time, and is remembered now only because of an inscribed tombstone that survived centuries. He did not command legions, did not serve as legate or tribune, did not achieve the political prominence that would make him a figure in historical narratives. His name appears in no ancient histories, no dramatic accounts of battles or political intrigues. He was, in many ways, entirely ordinary, an average centurion following a common career path, distinguished only by his persistence and by the mural crown earned late in life. Yet his ordinariness makes him valuable for understanding what Roman military life actually entailed for most of those who pursued it. Not the dramatic careers of legendary figures, but the patient accumulation of service, the waiting for promotions, the transfers between postings, the administrative work and routine inspections and training drills that filled the years. Maximus's 40 years of service were characterized more by steadiness than by excitement, more by administrative competence than by martial glory, more by endurance than by dramatic achievement. As we consider his life tonight, let it represent the thousands of other centurions whose names are lost, whose tombstones did not survive, whose careers followed similar patterns of patience and persistence. These were the men who actually sustained the Roman military system, not the celebrated generals whose victories are recorded in triumph narratives, but the middle-ranking officers who enforced daily discipline, maintained standards, managed the unglamorous logistics that made military operations possible. Maximus and men like him were the structural supports of Roman military power, anonymous but essential, ordinary but indispensable. The rhythm of his career enlistment, slow promotion through administrative roles, the long wait for centurion rank, service in multiple legions, eventually earning recognition for courage, dying in service after 40 years. This rhythm echoes across the centuries as a pattern repeated countless times. Each instance was an individual life with its own hopes and disappointments, moments of satisfaction and stretches of tedium. But taken together, these individual careers formed the collective reality of Roman military professionalism. Patient, persistent, committed to standards maintained not for glory, but because standards themselves mattered. Let this life, ordinary and anonymous, represent tonight the unglamorous reality behind imperial power, the decades of routine service, the administrative work no one celebrates, the patience required to wait years for promised advancement, the transfers that prevented putting down roots, the late career achievement of a mural crown that proved courage, but came after most of life had already been lived in military routine. This was the reality of being a centurion for most who held the rank. Not thrilling, not dramatic, but steady, persistent, and utterly essential to the empire they served. The earth preserves what human memory forgets. Across the former territories of the Roman Empire, buried beneath centuries of accumulated soil and vegetation, lie the physical remnants of military life, not the grand monuments that emperors erected to celebrate victories, but the ordinary detritus of daily existence. Pottery shards discarded after meals, broken tools replaced and thrown away, personal items lost and never recovered. These fragments, emerging now through archaeological excavation, offer testimony about Centurion life that complements and sometimes contradicts the written sources. Consider the excavations at Brumenium Fort, the northernmost outpost along Hadrian's Wall in what is now Northumberland. Here, in recent years, teams of archaeologists and volunteers have carefully removed layers of earth, revealing artifacts that Roman soldiers last touched nearly 2 millennia ago. Among the discoveries, spearheads and lead shot from slingers, the standard equipment of frontier warfare. A lead seal, the type used to authenticate official documents, reminds us of the administrative burden that accompanied military service. Bronze lamps that once illuminated dark barracks and administrative offices. Brooches, including an intact dolphin-style piece with preserved enamel personal adornments that remind us these were individuals with aesthetic preferences, not merely military functionaries. One amphora fragment bore marks indicating it originated in Spain, having traveled thousands of miles to reach this remote northern frontier, likely carrying olive oil. The logistics required to transport such goods across the empire, to ensure that even distant garrisons received supplies from Mediterranean production centers, speaks to the administrative complexity that centurions helped manage. Someone had to receive these shipments, verify their contents, distribute them appropriately, maintain records of inventories. The amphora itself is silent about these processes, but its presence implies them. Archaeological evidence also reveals aspects of life that written sources rarely mention. 2 engraved intaglios discovered at Brumenium suggest that grape harvesting occurred at the site and unexpected, indication of agricultural activity at a military fort in northern Britain. Did soldiers cultivate vineyards during their off-duty hours? Was wine production part of the fort's supply strategy? The artifacts pose questions that remain partially unanswered, mysteries embedded in objects recovered from the earth. Perhaps no archaeological discovery has illuminated Roman military life more dramatically than the Vindolanda tablets over 1,700 thin wooden sheets, inscribed with cursive Latin in carbon-based ink, preserved through extraordinary circumstance in the waterlogged soil of a Roman fort behind Hadrian's Wall. These tablets, dating primarily to the period around 100 CE, comprise correspondence, administrative accounts, and personal messages written by and to the garrison members. The tablets were found largely in a waterlogged rubbish heap at the corner of the commander's house-discarded documents that their original writers never intended for posterity. They were everyday communications, drafts of letters, routine records that served immediate practical purposes and were then thrown away when no longer needed. Their preservation is almost accidental, dependent on specific soil conditions that prevented the normal decay of organic materials. Had Vindolanda's soil been slightly different, these voices from the past would have been silenced forever. What do the tablets reveal? First and most obviously, the sheer volume of written communication that military administration required. These are not literary compositions, but working documents, accounts of supplies received and distributed, rosters of personnel, reports on unit readiness, requests for equipment and supplies. One tablet contains references to a brewer, suggesting that beer production was part of the fort's economy. Others detail transactions involving wheat, hides, and sinews, the raw materials of military sustenance and equipment manufacture. The tablets include correspondence from Flavius Cerialis, prefect of the 9th cohort of Batavians, and his wife Sulpicia Lepidina. While these are not centurions, but higher-ranking officers, their correspondence illuminates the broader context in which centurions operated. There are invitations to social occasions, including a famous birthday party invitation that may be the oldest surviving document written in Latin by a woman. There are requests for supplies, complaints about conditions, personal messages that reveal the writers as individuals with relationships and concerns beyond their military duties. For Centurions, tablets like these represent the documentary burden they manage daily. Every tablet recording supplies, personnel movements, or administrative matters reflects decisions made, records kept, and reports compiled. The Centurion who maintained inventories of wheat and hides did work similar to that. Documented in these tablets work, they consumed hours, but left little trace in historical narratives because it was too ordinary to warrant comment by ancient historians. Archaeological discoveries force us to confront the mundane realities that written histories often omit. Consider the pottery sherds found at virtually every Roman military site. These fragments represent vessels that once held food and drink and were used daily by soldiers and officers alike. They broke as pottery does and were discarded. Their ubiquity in archaeological contexts speaks to the continuous cycle of use and replacement that characterized military supply systems. A centurion would have been responsible for ensuring that his century had adequate cooking and eating vessels, that broken items were replaced, that supplies were managed efficiently. The pottery sherds, scattered across excavation sites, are the physical evidence of systems that once functioned but have now ceased. Each fragment implies procurement, distribution, use, breakage, disposal processes that occurred countless times, managed by officers for whom this was simply part of the routine. Military equipment excavated from fort sites reveals patterns of maintenance and replacement. Iron armor components show signs of repair patches added, links replaced, sections reinforced. The larica segmentata, the distinctive segmented armor of Roman legionaries, required constant maintenance due to its complex construction. Centurions supervised these repairs, ensuring that equipment remained serviceable. The archaeological evidence of repaired armor validates what written sources describe: the endless cycle of inspection, identification of defects, and correction that consumes so much of military life. The preservation of armor fragments also reveals information about manufacturing and distribution. Different armor types segmented, chainmail, scale coexisted in Roman military service, with evidence suggesting that even in the 2nd century CE, when segmented armor was common, chainmail remained standard issue. This diversity implies complex supply chains and administrative systems capable of tracking and distributing multiple equipment types. A centurion managing equipment inventories needed to know which soldiers had which armor types, which required maintenance, which needed replacement, and how to obtain necessary supplies. A logistical challenge reflected in the variety of armor fragments archaeologists recover. Among the symbols of centurion authority, none is more iconic than the vine staff vividus, a rod of vine wood approximately 1 meter in length that served as both badge of rank and instrument of discipline. Curiously, despite its prominence in written sources and its frequent depiction on tombstone reliefs, actual excavated examples of vine staffs are extremely rare. The staff appears constantly in visual representations. Tombstones show centurions holding their vine staffs, the curved or mushroom-shaped tops clearly visible. Literary sources reference centurions using their staffs to beat soldiers who failed to meet standards. Yet the staffs themselves, made of organic material, have largely decomposed, leaving only their images and their reputation. One vine staff, broken and given as a votive offering to the temple of Jupiter at Heliopolis, was famously presented to the Emperor Trajan when he inquired of the oracle about his upcoming Parthian campaign. This incident, preserved in historical accounts, is exceptional precisely because the staff survived long enough to be documented. Most vine staffs simply rotted away after their owners died or retired, leaving no trace beyond iconographic representations. The archaeological absence of vine staffs, contrasted with their omnipresence in visual and textual sources, creates an interesting tension. We know they existed. We know what they looked like. We know how they were used. Yet the objects themselves are ghost presences, implied but not recovered. This reminds us that archaeology provides incomplete evidence certain materials, preserve while others vanish. Certain aspects of life leave physical traces, while others evaporate without record. For a centurion, the vine staff was simultaneously a symbol of achieved status and a tool of daily work. It marked him as different from ordinary soldiers. It gave him the authority to enforce discipline through physical punishment. Yet it was also simply a stick useful for pointing during drills, for gesturing during instructions, for walking. The grandeur we might retroactively attribute to it was likely less present in daily use, where it was merely one of many tools the centurion employed in managing his century. Despite extensive archaeological work, significant aspects of centurion life remain mysterious or ambiguous. The precise nature of their living quarters, for example, varies across different fort sites, and we cannot always determine which structures housed centurions versus other officers. The quality and quantity of their personal possessions must be inferred from limited evidence, as burials and deposits rarely preserve complete assemblages that can be definitively associated with specific ranks. The decorative military equipment that centurions wore, the falerie, elaborate metal discs worn on a harness over armor, is well documented in visual representations and has been recreated based on archaeological finds. Yet the social meanings of these decorations, the specific circumstances under which they were worn, and the differences in practice between different regions and time periods remain subjects of scholarly debate. We can describe what they looked like. Determining exactly what they meant to those who wore them, beyond general status indication, requires speculation. Similarly, the social relationships between centurions and their soldiers, between centurions and higher officers, between centurions and civilian populations near military installations. These interpersonal dynamics are difficult to reconstruct from physical evidence alone. The Vindolanda tablets offer glimpses, but they represent a specific time and place, and we cannot assume that patterns evident at Vindolanda necessarily applied throughout the empire across different periods. The economic lives of centurions pose particular challenges. We know they received higher pay than ordinary soldiers. We know some accumulated significant wealth. But how did they manage their finances? How much did they save versus spend? What investments did they make? How did they plan for retirement? Archaeological evidence offers only partial answers. Burials sometimes contain goods that suggest wealth. Inscriptions sometimes mention property ownership, but the detailed financial strategies of individual centurions remain largely unknown. What archaeology reveals most clearly is not the exceptional, but the typical, not the dramatic moments, but the daily routines. The pottery fragments speak of meals eaten. The equipment fragments speak of maintenance performed. The writing tablets speak of records kept and correspondence maintained. The lead seals speak of official documents authenticated. The lamps speak of dark hours working by artificial light. Taken together, these fragments validate the picture of centurion life we have been constructing throughout this narrative. Routine, administrative, concerned with maintenance and documentation, requiring persistence rather than dramatic action. The archaeological record does not reveal glory. It reveals labor, the labor of keeping systems functioning, of maintaining standards, of managing supplies, of ensuring that every aspect of military life operated according to Roman expectations. As excavations continue at sites throughout the former empire, more artifacts emerge, more tablets are deciphered, more patterns become visible. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding, occasionally contradicts previous assumptions, and always reminds us that the past was populated by individuals whose lives were as complex and multifaceted as our own, even if only fragments of their material existence survive for us to study. The centurion who lost a brooch at Birminium nearly 2,000 years ago could not have imagined that it would be recovered, catalogued, studied, and displayed. The officer who drafted accounts on wooden tablets at Vindolanda and then threw them in a rubbish heap had no expectation that they would survive to the present day. Yet these objects persist, silent witnesses to lives that were ordinary in their own time, but become historically significant through their very ordinariness, representing not the exceptional but the typical, not the celebrated but the anonymous, not the dramatic but the routine. Let these fragments, emerging now from the Earth's long preservation, stand tonight as physical validation of the unglamorous reality we have been exploring. The Centurion's life, as revealed through archaeology, was a life of things of equipment maintained, supplies managed, documents drafted, possessions acquired and lost. These things, scattered across excavation sites, accumulating in museum collections, being slowly cataloged and studied, tell stories that complement and complicate the written record. They remind us that history is not only what was written down, but also what was used, broken, discarded, and buried. The material traces of lives lived day by day, in routine and repetition, far from the dramatic narratives that dominate historical consciousness. In the quiet work of archaeology, the careful excavation, the patient cataloging, the scholarly interpretation, we find a methodology that mirrors the Centurion's own approach to his duties. Methodical, persistent, concerned with details, accumulating knowledge slowly through sustained effort rather than dramatic revelation. The archaeologist and the Centurion, separated by 2 millennia, share a commitment to maintenance. The archaeologist maintaining our connection to the past, the Centurion maintaining the systems of empire. Both work largely in obscurity. Both produce results that others may take for granted. Both demonstrate that significance often lies not in spectacular achievement, but in steady, competent performance of necessary tasks. To understand the Centurion's position in Roman military society, we must first consider the world of the common legionary, the soldier who formed the foundation of the legion, whose labor sustained military operations, whose obedience made Roman discipline possible. These men enlisted for 25 years of service, committing the prime of their lives to military duty in exchange for regular pay, the possibility of plunder during campaigns, and a land grant upon honorable discharge. Their daily existence was characterized by constraint and hardship. 8 men shared a tent on campaign, or a single barrack room in permanent forts, the contubernium that became both living arrangement and tactical unit. Privacy was essentially non-existent. Personal space extended only to one's sleeping area, and perhaps a small wooden chest for possessions. The barracks were simple structures, the sleeping surfaces often just straw mats or basic wooden frames. Comfort was not a priority in military architecture. The food was adequate for sustenance, but monotonous. Pulls of porridge of barley or spelt formed the staple, supplemented by bread when grain supplies allowed for baking, cheese when available, olives as a source of fat, and occasionally meat or fish. Wine was distributed but diluted with water, both to make supplies last longer and to prevent drunkenness that might compromise discipline. This diet provided sufficient calories for the demanding physical labor soldiers performed, but it offered little variety or pleasure. Meals were functional rather than enjoyable, fuel rather than an experience to savor. The work was relentless. When not drilling or standing guard, soldiers performed construction labor, building and maintaining roads, repairing fortifications, digging ditches, hauling supplies, cutting timber, quarrying stone. On campaign, they might march 10 to 12 hours daily, carrying equipment that weighed approximately 40 kilograms. The phrase Marius's mules, referring to soldiers under the General Marius, captured this reality. Legionaries were beasts of burden as much as fighters, their backs carrying the weight of Rome's infrastructure projects as well as their weapons. Discipline was harsh and immediate. Infractions brought swift punishment, extra duties, reduced rations, beatings, or in serious cases, execution. The Centurion's vine staff was not merely symbolic but functional, used to strike soldiers who failed to meet standards. Desertion, falling asleep on guard duty, or cowardice in battle could result in decimation, the execution of 1 in every 10 men in a unit that had collectively failed, with the condemned selected by lot and killed by their comrades. This practice, though not routine, was documented often enough to be a genuine threat that reinforced obedience through fear. The legionary possessed limited autonomy over his own time and decisions. Orders directed his movements, his activities, his interactions. Leave was granted at the discretion of officers, and might be denied without explanation. Letters from home arrived irregularly, if at all, carried by whatever travelers happened to be moving between provinces. Communication with family was tenuous, dependent on literacy, which many soldiers lacked, and on the unreliable logistics of pre-industrial correspondence. Yet within this constrained existence, soldiers formed bonds of remarkable strength. The contubernium became a surrogate family, men who shared meals and shelters and dangers, who trusted each other with their lives in battle. These relationships provided emotional sustenance in an environment that offered little official recognition of soldiers' humanity. The camaraderie of fellow legionaries was often what made military life bearable, transforming anonymous institutional existence into something more personal and meaningful. The financial disparity between centurions and common soldiers was substantial and visible. In the late 2nd century CE, a common legionary received approximately 300 denarii per year. From this sum, deductions were made for food, equipment, and clothing expenses that consumed a significant portion of the nominal wage. What remained after these mandatory deductions might amount to very little, barely enough for small personal purchases, or to send modest sums to family. A centurion, by contrast, received approximately 3,750 denarii, annually 12.5 times the legionary's base pay. The most senior centurion ranks earned even more. The primus pilus, the highest-ranking centurion in a legion, might earn 4 times what an ordinary centurion received. This vast difference in compensation had immediate practical effects on quality of life. Centurions could afford better food. While legionaries ate pulse and basic bread, centurions purchased meat, better wine, imported delicacies. They could afford better accommodations, private quarters rather than shared barracks, furnishings rather than straw mats. They could afford personal servants or enslaved attendants to maintain their equipment and quarters. They could afford to send more substantial sums to family, to invest in property, to accumulate wealth that would support them after retirement. The visible markers of this wealth created social distance. A centurion's armor, while following standard patterns, was often of higher quality, better metal, finer workmanship, more elaborate decoration. The phaleri, the decorative metal discs worn on a harness over the armor, were symbols of rank and achievement unavailable to common soldiers. The transverse crest on a centurion's helmet, oriented front to back rather than side to side, immediately identified his rank even at a distance. These visual distinctions reinforced hierarchy, making status legible at a glance. The economic gulf also affected post-military prospects. A legionary who completed 25 years of service received his savings, whatever hadn't been spent during his service, and a land grant, typically in frontier regions where Rome wanted to establish veteran communities. This land grant provided the basis for subsistence farming, a modest retirement after decades of hard service. But it was fundamentally a working-class retirement, requiring continued labor to extract sustenance from the land. A centurion who saved prudently over his career might accumulate substantial wealth enough to purchase better land in more desirable locations, to invest in commercial ventures, to establish a comfortable retirement that didn't require physical labor. Some centurions became local notables in their retirement communities, their military pensions and accumulated savings giving them economic status that translated into social influence. The distance between ranks during service continued into retirement, shaping not just military life, but the entire trajectory of existence before and after. The relationship between centurion and legionary was fundamentally one of command and obedience. The centurion was responsible for his century's training, discipline, and combat effectiveness. He had broad discretionary authority to punish infractions, to assign duties, to determine daily routines within the general framework of legion regulations. His orders were not suggestions, but commands that required immediate compliance. This authority was enforced through multiple mechanisms. Physical punishment was routine. The Vine staff used to strike soldiers who performed inadequately, who showed disrespect, who failed to meet expectations. Extra duties served as another punishment, forcing a soldier to stand additional guard shifts, to perform extra labor details, to forfeit rest time as penalty for infractions. Reduction in rations, public humiliation, and confinement to quarters were other tools in the Centurion's disciplinary arsenal. The Centurion's authority extended beyond formal military matters into many aspects of soldiers' lives. He mediated disputes between soldiers in his century, rendering judgment on personal conflicts. He granted or denied leave, determining who could visit the nearby vicus and who must remain in the fort. He assessed sick calls, deciding whether a soldier claiming illness was genuinely incapacitated or attempting to avoid duty. These powers gave the Centurion enormous influence over the quality of his soldiers' daily existence. Yet this authority came with responsibility. A Centurion whose century performed poorly reflected badly on his leadership. If soldiers were inadequately trained, if equipment was poorly maintained, if discipline was lax, the Centurion faced accountability from higher officers. The tribune or legate commanding the legion evaluated centurions based on their century's performance. Poor leadership could result in demotion, transfer to less prestigious postings, or loss of rank entirely. A centurion was also expected to be a role model. He was supposed to embody military virtues, courage in battle, endurance in hardship, strict adherence to regulations. The expectation was that he would never demand of his soldiers what he himself would not do, that he would share dangers rather than directing from safety, that he would maintain standards even when doing so was difficult or unpopular. Whether individual centurions consistently met this ideal is questionable, human nature being what it is, but the ideal itself shaped expectations and provided a standard against which performance could be judged. The centurion occupied a peculiar position in military social structure, elevated above the common soldiers, yet still distinct from the aristocratic officers who commanded legions. He was not of the senatorial or equestrian class. The path to higher command, to tribune, legate, or governor, was essentially closed to him, regardless of his competence or achievements. His career ceiling was the rank of primus pilus, the senior centurion of the first cohort, and even that position was attainable only by a small fraction of centurions. This created a particular social dynamic. The centurion had risen from the ranks. He had once been a common soldier himself, sharing barracks and rations and hardships with men who are now his subordinates. This shared background could create understanding, an awareness of soldiers' concerns and challenges based on personal experience. But it also required the maintenance of careful boundaries. Too much familiarity with former peers could undermine authority. The centurion needed to be separate, distinct, recognizably different from those he now commanded. Some centurions managed this transition smoothly, maintaining discipline through respect earned by competence and fair treatment. Others, perhaps insecure in their authority or resentful of their ambiguous status, became martinets enforcing regulations harshly, using their vine staffs liberally, ruling through fear rather than respect. Ancient sources preserve complaints about brutal centurions, officers whose cruelty provoked resentment and, in extreme cases, mutiny. The centurion nicknamed Cedo Alterum, bring me another, so called because he broke so many vine staffs beating soldiers that he constantly needed replacements, became notorious enough that his name was preserved in historical accounts as an example of excessive brutality. The social distance was also maintained through separation of living arrangements and daily routines. While soldiers shared cramped barracks, centurions had private quarters. While soldiers ate together in their contubernum groups, centurions often dined separately or with other officers. While soldiers' movements were restricted, centurions had greater freedom to visit civilian settlements, to socialize with local elites, to participate in activities beyond the fort's daily routine. Yet the centurion could not truly join the world of aristocratic officers either. The tribunes and legates came from wealthy families, had received rhetorical education, possessed social connections that extended to Rome's highest political circles. Their military service was often temporary, a phase in political careers that would lead to Senate seats, governorships, and positions of genuine political power. The centurion, by contrast, was a career military professional whose entire life had been spent in the legions and who would retire to modest prosperity at best. This in-between status above the common soldiers, but below the aristocratic, command shaped the centurion's identity and perspective. He was a middle manager in an intensely hierarchical organization, wielding significant authority within his limited domain, but ultimately subordinate to officers whose social background, rather than military competence, often determined their positions. From the perspective of the common legionary, the centurion was a figure of considerable power, someone whose decisions directly affected daily life, whose approval or disapproval mattered immediately and personally. A fair centurion who enforced standards consistently, who recognized good performance, who distributed burdens equitably, could make military service bearable despite its hardships. A centurion who played favorites, who used his authority arbitrarily, who demanded much but gave little recognition, could make the same service miserable. Soldiers developed sophisticated assessments of their centurions' characters and capabilities. They knew which centurions were competent in combat and which were merely harsh disciplinarians. They knew which could be approached with legitimate concerns and which would respond to any question with punishment. They knew which maintained standards because those standards were genuinely important and which enforced trivial regulations to demonstrate authority. These assessments, shared among soldiers in quiet conversations, shaped a centurion's reputation, a form of evaluation that happened beneath official channels, but was no less real for being informal. The soldier's relationship with his centurion was fundamentally unequal and non-voluntary. He could not choose his centurion, could not request a transfer to another century, except under extraordinary circumstances, could not appeal the centurion's decisions except to higher authority, an option that risked being labeled a troublemaker. The centurion's authority was structural rather than consensual, backed by military law, and ultimately by the threat of severe punishment for disobedience. Yet within this authoritarian framework, there was some room for human relationship. A soldier who performed well, who met standards consistently, who demonstrated reliability, might earn a centurion's respect. That respect might translate into small benefits, assignment to less onerous duties, recommendation for promotion, consideration for early leave. These were not rights, but privileges, granted at the centurion's discretion, but they mattered greatly to soldiers whose lives offered few pleasures or recognitions. The common soldier also recognized that the centurion's position, while privileged relative to his own, was not without burdens. The centurion bore responsibility for everything his century did or failed to do. He faced accountability that soldiers themselves did not. His decisions were scrutinized by higher officers. His performance was constantly evaluated. If the century failed, the centurion's career suffered. This created a certain alignment of interests. The centurion needed his soldiers to perform well, and soldiers' success reflected on their centurion, even within the larger context of unequal power. The physical conditions of military life varied dramatically by rank. Consider the experience of winter in a northern frontier fort, say, along Hadrian's Wall or the Germanic lines. For the common legionary, winter meant sleeping in cold barracks, huddled under inadequate blankets, heat provided only by small fires that struggled against the drafts, infiltrating through gaps in wood and stone. Morning meant rising in darkness and cold, pulling on frigid armor, performing duties in weather that offered no mercy to discomfort. For the centurion, the same winter was experienced differently. His private quarters, while not luxurious, were better insulated, warmer, more protected from the elements. He might have a brazier providing heat in his room, better blankets, the resources to purchase additional clothing for warmth. His armor, when he put it on, had been maintained by attendants rather than by his own cold, stiffened fingers. His breakfast, while still simple, might include hot food, better wine, portions more generous than the soldiers' rations. These differences in physical comfort accumulated over years of service. The soldier who spent 25 winters in cold barracks, whose body absorbed decades of damp and chill and inadequate rest, might emerge from military service with health permanently compromised. The Centurion, experiencing those same winters, but with better food, better shelter, better conditions, might retire in significantly better physical condition, despite being older. The same pattern applied to medical care. When illness or injury struck, both soldiers and centurions received treatment from military medical personnel. But centurions, with their higher pay and greater autonomy, could supplement military medicine with private physicians if stationed near civilian settlements. They could afford better nutrition during recovery. They could purchase medicines or treatments unavailable to common soldiers. The quality of care available was stratified by rank, as was nearly everything else in military life. At the end of military service, the common legionary received an honorable discharge, a land grant, and whatever savings he had accumulated. If he was literate, he might receive a bronze diploma documenting his service and conferring citizenship if he had not possessed it already. This was not nothing. It represented genuine recognition and provided a foundation for civilian life after military service. But it was fundamentally a working-class retirement, requiring continued labor and offering modest prosperity at best. The centurion's retirement reflected his higher status during service. His accumulated savings, if managed prudently, might amount to a substantial nest, egg enough to purchase significant property, to invest in commercial ventures, to live comfortably without continued labor. Some centurions became local magistrates or important figures in their retirement communities, their military experience and financial resources giving them status and influence. The centurion who had spent 40 years in service, who had commanded men and managed operations across multiple provinces, brought skills and connections valuable in civilian contexts. The tombstones erected after death reflected these status differences. A common soldier's gravestone, if he received one at all, might bear his name, his unit, his years of service, and perhaps a brief dedication from comrades or family. A centurion's tombstone, by contrast, often displayed elaborate relief carvings showing him in full equipment, holding his vine staff, wearing his decorative harness. The inscriptions detailed his career path, listed his decorations, enumerated his service in multiple legions. Even in death, a visual and textual representation of life served demonstrated the distance between ranks. Throughout all aspects of military life living conditions, food quality, pay, autonomy, post-service prospects hierarchy was not merely acknowledged, but actively maintained and visually reinforced. The Roman military operated on the principle that clear chains of command, strictly enforced, enabled effective operations. Blurring these distinctions would, in Roman thinking, undermine the discipline that made Roman armies effective. The centurion's position within this hierarchy was simultaneously privileged and limited. He wielded considerable authority over his soldiers, enjoyed far better material conditions than those he commanded, and could accumulate wealth that common soldiers could only imagine. Yet he remained fundamentally separate from the aristocratic elite, who held ultimate command authority, whose social status was determined by birth rather than military achievement, whose careers encompassed civilian politics as well as military service. This middle position, the distance from soldiers below and from aristocratic officers above, defined the centurion's social identity. He was neither common soldier nor elite commander, but something distinct, occupying a space between the two. His authority was real but circumscribed, his prosperity substantial but not aristocratic, his status respected within the military structure but not transferable to broader political power. As we consider tonight the unglamorous reality of Centurion life, this social dimension adds complexity to the picture. The Centurion was not merely engaged in routine administrative work and mundane supervision. He was also navigating a complex social hierarchy, maintaining authority over former peers while remaining subordinate to social superiors, wielding power within constraints, enjoying privileges while recognizing limits. The psychological demands of this position, managing relationships up and down the hierarchy, maintaining discipline without alienating soldiers, demonstrating competence to superiors while acknowledging their authority, were as demanding as the physical and administrative burdens of the role. The vast distance between Centurion and common legionary, measured in pay and living conditions and post-service prospects, reminds us that Roman military life was not a brotherhood of equals, but a strictly stratified hierarchy, where everyone's place was defined and maintained. Understanding this distance helps us appreciate the Centurion's position, not as inherently glamorous, but as simultaneously privileged and constrained, powerful and limited, elevated and still fundamentally subordinate within a vast imperial military machine that extended far beyond any individual officer's authority or control.